We begin this hour with President Trump's war in Iran, where a permanent end remains as uncertain as ever, while what the White House still insists is a ceasefire is tested. Meanwhile, as our colleague Jonathan Lemire writes in The Atlantic, an outside advisor says Trump is, quote, bored with the war he started, and, quote, he doesn't want it to upend his high-stakes summit next week in China. He is ready to move on. So he shouldn't start wars then. That's been clear from his shifting language about the conflict. Just a week ago, he dismissed the role of Congress, telling congressional leaders that hostilities have terminated to circumvent the war powers resolution, only to say this hours later.
We're in a war because I think you would agree we cannot let lunatics have a nuclear weapon. Do you agree?
We're in a war, but then maybe we're not. It's very unclear. But this week, as the tenuous pause in hostilities becomes more questionable, he's had a different take.
We're in I call it a mini war because that's all they are. We're in a little skirmish, military. I call it a skirmish because Iran has no chance. I call it a skirmish because that's what it is. It's a skirmish. And we're doing unbelievably well.
After these strikes, is the ceasefire with Iran still on?
Yeah, it is. They trifled with us today. We blew them away. They trifled. I call that a trifle.
Trifle, skirmish, war. Words used to mean things. Joining us now, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington State, ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Language does matter. And the President of the United States calling this a skirmish, an excursion, all of those things help us to and lead us to believe the reporting that's been out there for really months that the president is bored with this. While the American people are suffering, while 13 American service members that we know of have been killed, while hundreds and hundreds of maybe even thousands of people in the Middle East are constantly being sent away from their homes. Talk a little bit about the disconnect between what we're seeing with the president and the actual status of what's happening on the ground.
Well, I think you nailed it up front. I mean, President Trump wants to act like words and facts no longer matter. I like the way he says, that's what I call it. Okay. As if he has, some unique language and unique take on the world that the rest of us don't see. But the truth is, words and facts do still matter. Trump tries very hard, and frankly, it scares me the degree to which he is successful in fooling people into thinking that they don't, but they do. And the truth of what's going on right now is that we are stuck because Iran doesn't want to negotiate about what we want to negotiate. Up front, the president thought that a 4 to 6 week bombing campaign with that initial, quote, decapitation strike, end quote, that Iran basically would buckle in the face of that. Now, all of the experts who looked at it before that, including me serving on the Armed Services Committee, said, no, that's not going to work. 4 to 6 weeks into it being obvious that it wasn't going to work. So Iran was still standing. Meanwhile, the costs that you outlined had been incurred. 13 service members killed, hundreds wounded, thousands of civilians killed, the global economy in free fall, gas prices, fertilizer, all of that had happened. And we hadn't gotten any closer to accomplishing our goals. So step 2 was blockade. Okay, thinking that the blockade could cause that. And experts are saying that that won't cause Iran to cave either. So the blockade is now the fight. Now, the truth of the matter is blockade occasionally requires shooting because sometimes you have to blockade, people push back. So no, it's not a ceasefire. We've just moved from a war where Trump thought bombing would achieve objectives to a war he thinks a blockade, which, by the way, is an act of war.
Exactly.
We're doing less shooting, but not a ceasefire. And those are the facts. That's what's out there. He can call it whatever he wants to call it, but that's what's going on.
Congressman, I want to ask you about the China of it all, because as Eugene mentioned at the top, the president is heading to China next week. I'm going to be heading there soon to cover his trip when he meets with President Xi Jinping. But what do you expect China will try to extract from the United States, extract from the president, in exchange for their help with negotiating a potential end to the Iran war?
Well, I think it's just another sort of card that China has to play, to use one of Trump's favorite phrases, in the challenge that we have with China, which is how to compete with them in a rational way. I actually led a congressional delegation to China last September, the first one that had gone in a number of years. And the conversations were interesting. China is less combative towards the U.S. than they were 3-4 years ago. Part of that is underrated. The Biden administration did a decent job of trying to calm those things down and actually have a rational conversation with China. But we still have big differences of opinion, primarily over economics, but also China wants to have a greater say in the rules-based international order. And I think China will use the situation in Iran to try to leverage more power for them and a better economic deal. And they have a lot of leverage here. Because going back to the blockade, presumption of the blockade is it will force Iran to crumble because their economy will fall apart. Well, China's going to have a ton to say about that. If China keeps helping Iran economically, that dramatically extends the amount of time that Iran can survive this blockade. So I think China has more leverage now because of the weak position Trump has put us in with regard to the war, not just in Iran, but the war in the Middle East.
Congressman, I want to ask you about a different global adversary, the Russia of it all. The New York Times reported this week that Russia is shipping drone components to Iran via the Caspian Sea. This is according to U.S. officials, helping Iran rebuild its offensive abilities after losing roughly 60% of its drone arsenal during recent fighting. These officials spoke anonymously to divulge private military assessments. First of all, have you been briefed about the possibility that Russia is shipping drone components? And secondly, there's been a lot of speculation that actually it was China that was replenishing Iran's military capabilities and missiles and assisting them with keeping their stockpiles up. And so obviously the meeting this week could address that, but what could be done to try to counter what Russia is doing now?
Yeah, well, it seems to be a little of both. In fact, that adds to the point I made a moment ago. Russia, too, is trying to find ways to help Iran. If Iran was truly isolated, that would be different in terms of how effective a blockade could be. But they're not, and they're not because of what you just said. Both Russia and China are finding ways to help them. The details of that, we're not 100% sure on all aspects of it. A, B, some of it is classified, but there's no question Russia and China are helping Iran, and that makes it tougher to bring Iran to heel, basically. And that's the global picture, something that Trump, who doesn't have much of a detailed understanding of anything, didn't see. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and also various terrorist organizations all have one thing in common. They want to weaken the United States. And increasingly in recent years, they are finding ways to work together, even though there's big differences between all those groups I just mentioned. The one thing they have in common is they think a weaker U.S. gives them a freer hand in the world. So they will find ways to work together, which is also why it's so important that we stand with Ukraine. And the Trump administration has struggled to do that. And there's a lot of different facts there. But the way I always like to sum it up, Trump rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin, has constantly praised him. He brought Zelensky into the Oval Office and basically belittled and insulted him for an hour. So he undermined our ability to clearly stand with Ukraine, a place where Russia is in big trouble. But that's the picture. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, various terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, they all want to weaken us. They're working together. So just stumbling into a war in the Middle East just empowered that group it weakened us on our own. And Trump should have seen that coming.
Congressman, on the politics of it, your counterpart in the Senate, Roger Wicker, was saying that the public understands the necessity of the Iran war. Do you think that the public understands?
Well, no, I don't even know that Trump understands it, because he keeps saying they can't have a nuclear weapon. They didn't have a nuclear weapon when this war started. In fact, we were in negotiations to try to make it less likely that Iran would get one. Again, the details of what they have is classified. I've been briefed on it. There's a breakout time, how long it would take them to build one. They're not there yet, but they're close. So negotiating a way to reduce their likelihood of getting a nuclear weapon was our best path forward when Trump started this war. So, no, I don't think the American public understands fully why Trump is doing this war, because Trump doesn't. And again, I think the truth of it is he made an impulse decision, thinking he could be the guy who would bring down the Iranian regime once and for all, something that factually it was very clear wasn't going to happen, and that the cost of trying was going to escalate day by day, week by week to an entirely unacceptable level. But he took that shot. He took that chance. If nuclear weapons was what this was about, then we were in a stronger position before this war started to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon than we are now.
What we are witnessing is not just a conflict abroad, but a collapse of clarity at the highest level of leadership. When the same situation is described as a war, a skirmish, and a trifle within days, it reveals something far more dangerous than inconsistency. It reveals a lack of seriousness about the consequences of power. Language is not cosmetic in geopolitics. It shapes perception, strategy, and accountability. When leaders blur definitions, they also blur responsibility. Calling an active military engagement a mini-war does not reduce its human cost. It simply distances decision-makers from the reality that soldiers are dying, civilians are being displaced, and entire regions are destabilizing. What's more troubling is the apparent improvisation behind the strategy itself. The idea that a short bombing campaign could force a complex nation into submission reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of modern conflict. History has repeatedly shown that resilience, not rapid collapse, is the more common outcome. When that initial assumption failed, the shift to a blockade wasn't a solution. It was an admission that the original plan lacked depth. Meanwhile, the global stage does not pause for miscalculations. Rivals are not passive observers. They are active participants looking for advantage. As the situation drags on, other powers step in, extending the conflict's lifespan and complicating any resolution. What was framed as a decisive move begins to look more like an opening for others to reshape influence. There is also a deeper contradiction at play. If the central concern was preventing nuclear escalation, then abandoning diplomatic leverage in favor of military action seems counterintuitive. Negotiations, however imperfect, offer control and predictability. War, especially one entered without clear objectives, offers neither. Perhaps the most concerning aspect is the sense of detachment. When leadership appears bored with a conflict it initiated, it sends a chilling message about how decisions are made. Wars are not episodes to move on from. They are realities that unfold long after the headlines fade. In the end, this is not just about one policy or one moment. It is about whether leadership treats global conflict as a serious, long-term responsibility or as something that can be redefined, reframed, and ultimately ignored when it becomes inconvenient.